Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining MPA's Frankly Speaking webinar series. We're really pleased that you're able to join us today, and I'm really excited about an exciting webinar today. My name is Brent Walker. I'm a co-founder and managing director of Morrison Park Advisors. Morrison Park is one of Canada's leading independent financial advisory firms, and one of our key focuses is in the area of environmental, social, and governance issues. So this is a very topical webinar that we have today. And our episode is entitled Beyond Consultation, a Win-Win Roadmap to Indigenous Participation. So again, I'd like to thank all our audience members for joining us today. And we're really excited to be speaking with you today on this topic. One of the things I want to start with is a land acknowledgement. And although we're coming to you virtually, one of our offices is in Toronto, and as a way of recognizing the presence and resilience of the Indigenous peoples in this area for time immemorial, we acknowledge that the land we are hosting from is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. And with that, I'd like to get started. I'm going to have each of my panelists introduce themselves. I've got Steve Altman and Oliver McLaren and Jody Anderson, but I'd like each of them to introduce themselves. And Jody, perhaps you could get us started.
Sure, thanks, Brent, and thank you, Miigwech, for that land acknowledgement. I am coming to you today from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people here in Ottawa. Buju, Wani, Jody Anderson, Indigenous, Couchiching, and Dojabao, Ottawa, Ninda. In my Ojibwe language, I said my name and also that I am a member of the Couchiching First Nation located in Treaty 3 area. I am also the Director of Business Development for the First Nations Finance Authority, which operates out of the West Bank First Nation. So a little bit of me is all over the place, but I'm happy to be here virtually, and hello to all the participants that have joined us today. Miigwech.
Thank you, Jody. Oliver?
Thanks, Brent, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. My name's Oliver McLaren. I'm a partner at Olthius Clear Townshend with offices in Yellowknife and Toronto. We're a law firm specializing in Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty. My specialty at Olthius Clear Townshend is equity partnerships in large resource developments. And so we've worked closely with the FNFA and with MPA on reaching mutually advantageous opportunities for the clients that we work with.
Thank you, Oliver. And last but not least, my partner, Steve Altman.
Thanks, Brent. As Brent said, I'm a partner of Brent's at MPA, Morrison Park Advisors. I'm a managing director and heading up the mining team there. We've been fortunate enough to be able to use our skill set at MPA in terms of our banking and financial expertise to help out First Nation communities across Canada. So I'm very excited to be part of this panel and look forward to it, Brent.
Thank you, Steve. And just one other bit of housekeeping before we get started. We have about 45 minutes of content that we want to share with you today. And then after that, we are offering an opportunity to our participants to ask some questions of our panelists. So I think to do that, I'll obviously prompt people when it's time for the Q&A to start. But if you have a question and you'd like one of our panelists to answer it, just type your question in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen, and we'll get to those a little bit later in the session. So thank you very much. And why don't we get started? And Oliver, I think I just have some questions I want to talk to you about. One of the landmark cases that came across in the last couple of years, of course, is the Trans Mountain decision. And when you read that, it's very clear that the old idea of Indigenous consultation is no longer relevant. The idea that there's a check the box process where you meet with people and then keep doing what you were doing before, that is no longer the case. And I think it's very clear now that the framework that we're operating in requires true bona fide engagement and good faith negotiation with Indigenous peoples that are impacted by projects on their territories. So, Oliver, you've done a lot of work in this area. Can you take us through some of the highlights of the way you see the framework in Canada today with these projects that you work on?
Yeah, certainly. I think it's helpful to go back a little bit and understand the way that this has evolved to where we're at today. And it's a bunch of different factors that are moving in concert with each other. But essentially, through the 90s, the Supreme Court of Canada started really breathing life into Section 35 of the Constitution, which affirms existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. And decisions over that time really started wrestling with what that actually means, with the development of a body of law that basically focused on, if impacts are going to happen to these rights, how is that going to be properly accounted for in the process of engagement that occurs from that. In 2004, the Supreme Court of Canada released a landmark decision called Haida Nation. And they understood that if there's going to be impacts to the Aboriginal and treaty rights of First Nations, that has to be properly consulted and accommodated in order to reduce that amount of impact, in order to recognize that those rights exist. That's on a spectrum. So the more severe an impact and the clearer the right, the deeper the amount of consultation that was required. Practically how that ended up developing itself is companies wanted to have certainty that they were doing enough. And so a bunch of companies started developing, consultation protocols with these check boxes to make sure that they were evidencing consultation, so that if a First Nation, came out and said the consultation has been inadequate, then there'd be a volume of evidence that the company had put together to say, no, we did our work. Problem with that was, lots of First Nations didn't have the capacity to be able to respond to all of the technical reports that they were getting from companies. And so you get, communities in areas with just, developments that were on fire, like the oil sands or something, and massive like hundreds and hundreds of pages coming into band offices and no capacity to be able to move through these. So the companies would check the box and say, yes, we've sent out all of these materials. We didn't receive any response to that. Well, then there was a lot of challenges that would come from that. And so the way that the law is developed to become more certain is saying, look, we really need to focus on making sure that our engagements are much, much, much more meaningful. And that the First Nations are going to come away from this experience saying either, yes, we've been adequately consulted and accommodated, or no, we haven't. And there's a lot more certainty in how that process is developing.
And, you used a word there that is really important. And I think we'll come back to it probably again and again, and that's capacity. How have you seen the tools evolve so that if a First Nation gets these reams of reports, what tools do the communities have to actually build that capacity to actually be able to be effective and have an effective seat at the table?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. So that is one of the key things that's developed over time, is ensuring that there's strong experts on the First Nation side that they have the ability to hire, that are able to evaluate the project and give them an informed perspective on it, so that they truly understand, what the environmental impacts are going to be, what the financial impacts are going to be, and what the traditional use impacts are going to be about moving this forward. And so what we typically see inside of engagement agreements with proponents that want to move ahead with a resource project is clear capability of First Nations to ensure that they have the time to both go out on the land and ground truth the land about how their community actually uses this particular area that's going to be affected. But in addition to that, hire the experts that they need to be able to give them a perspective on the project, so that when they sit at the table with the proponent, they actually have an informed understanding of this project and to be able to engage them effectively.
And our project proponents, willing to put forward the resources to retain those experts?
Well,
or
yeah,
are they forced to, or how does that work?
It's a good question. I mean, certainly in respect of being able to evidence that adequate consultation has occurred, it's very important that there's informed understanding. You hear this concept I'll talk about later about informed consent, but that's something that's required. I think it really depends on the industry. Mining exploration's tough because there's not as much money around to be able to spend on generating that information. Whereas when you have a full-blown mine, the proponent is usually very, very focused on making sure that the community is adequately resourced to participate in that. So it depends a little bit on the industry. It also depends on the proponent. We would say in our office, more progressive proponents allocate a bit of their budget to this in advance because they understand that it will be something that a stitch in time saves nine. The better work that they do in advance, the better engagement they're going to get, the more certainty that they have the First Nations that are around their projects are not going to be an uncertainty regarding the consultation question.
Well, Steve, you must see that in the mining side. I mean, the mining companies that are trying to develop these projects must see that certainty has value, and so are prepared to sort of facilitate that diligence process. Is that a fair comment? You're just on mute, Steve.
Sorry about that. Absolutely, Brent. We see that one of the big battles, and we'll talk about it later, I'm sure, but one of the big battles here is the ability to finance the project and get it moving forward. And that, and those discussions always have an impact when talking between the First Nations and the executives of the mining companies. But absolutely, that is a material part of the equation.
And Jody, maybe I'll just ask you a question while we're in this topic. I mean, one of the things that you and I have been chatting about over the last couple of weeks is, this concept of a win-win. And I think that's really what we're talking about here is that the win for a project developer is that they are able to finance a project and get it off the ground and have certainty. And obviously, the win for the community is that they get these impacts addressed and are put in a position where the communities are more sustainable going forward. Can you maybe just talk about the win-win aspect of this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in a lot of situations, First Nations are wanting to engage. Early engagement is absolutely key and critical to a lot of the success in any project, whether large or small. When there's a lack of engagement, it tends to slow down the progress of the completion of the projects. And so I think a lot of proponents are starting to realize that the earlier we engage, the better it is, not only for the partner, but for the First Nations, and looking at what are the benefits to bringing in the First Nations. Kind of changing the lens here in terms of there's a lot of benefits that can be brought to the table by engaging early or engaging period with First Nations. Well,
and Oliver, I mean, I think from a very practical point of view, we've seen what happens when the consultation is not adequate. And I think Trans Mountain's a great example. That project was very adversely affected by the process that they went through there.
Yeah, I think that's a really important sort of question that parties are always sort of wrestling with. What does it look like when consultation is not adequate? What does it look like when a project can't proceed? And that's a very difficult question. I actually think that Ontario's done quite a good job in terms of setting up programs to ensure that is facilitated. And I spent earlier part of my career working on renewable energy projects that were supported by financing from the Ontario, Aboriginal Loan Guarantee Program. So a guarantee being put up by Ontario that would help these thinly capitalized communities participate in projects that were occurring in their territory. And the amount of buy-in, the amount of engagement that happened from those really excellently designed supports were the difference between being able to roll out that program quickly and a bunch of challenges to projects that would never get off the ground.
Yeah, that's a great point, and actually that's a good segue, I think, into the next chapter of the webinar, and where I really want to maybe spend some time talking to you guys about, building on this concept of the tools that need to be in place for this consultation process to be effective. And, obviously one of the most important tools is the availability of financing for these types of projects. And, Jody, you're here today as a representative of the First Nations Finance Authority, and that's one tool that is out there. It's significantly evolved and expanded recently. And I know, in some of our chats to prepare for this webinar, you were really helping me to understand it and recognizing that there's some misconceptions out there about how the First Nations Finance Authority works. So perhaps you can clear some of that up for us and maybe just describe a little bit the mandate of the First Nations Authority and how you sort of do business.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Brent. And I think it is important to kind of explain to the audience who we are. First and foremost, we, the First Nations Finance Authority, or I'm just going to throw out the acronym because it's easier to say FNFA. We all love our acronyms. We are First Nations owned and operated, and we operate as a not-for-profit pooled borrowing institution. So we're set up to provide First Nation governments with access to capital at the best possible rates and the best possible terms. So we've said it before, access to capital is absolutely critical, and it was always seen as a barrier for participation, equity participation, in a lot of the larger projects that are happening across Canada. And essentially, we are here to, in the same types of, to give First Nation governments access to the same types of affordable financing any other local or regional or federal government would be able to access to build a better quality of life for their citizens. We want to level the playing field. Before the First Nations Finance Authority was established, First Nation governments, were not always recognized as governments. They may have been recognized as commercial entities, and truly really only had the option of accessing capital either from banks or private lenders. And typically they were offered at much higher rates. And so First Nations, cash flow is very, very important. And just like anybody else, any other government on this earth, they can't prosper from being dependent on receiving transfers from other levels of government. They want to participate in the economy. They want to build their own economy. So, getting into economic development and starting to generate revenues is really important. So I think that the FNFA can offer this extremely powerful tool. It is important to know that we are modeled after a pooled government borrowing authority. So we're not new. This is not, First Nations are not a guinea pig to this. This model has been around for years and years. It's been tried, tested, and true. We operate under the federal piece of legislation, which is called the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. And we also have subsequent regulations that everyone kind of forgets about, but we are regulated by to provide financing, investment opportunities, and advisory services for First Nation governments across Canada. And I think it's important to note that this piece of legislation is an optional piece of legislation. And for those who are not aware, most First Nations operate under what's called the Indian Act, which was imposed on First Nations. So when our First Nation leaders developed and established this piece of legislation, it was very, very important that this was not imposed, that First Nations voluntarily become scheduled, put up their hand and say, I want to participate in this piece of legislation. And alternatively, if time goes on and they realize that there's a change, that they also have the ability to opt out down the line. So that was very important in the development of this. And we have, like you said, we have grown exponentially over the past number of years. Our first debenture was issued in 2014 for $90 million. And in January, we just passed the $1 billion mark in terms of financing projects across First Nation. And by the end of the year, we're now on track to reach our $2 billion milestone.
Oh, $2 billion.
Yeah.
That's very significant. And for the finance wonks among us, I mean, you effectively have a government investment grade credit rating.
We do, yeah. We have 2 investment grade credit ratings, both by Standard & Poor's and Moody's Investor Service, which allow us to access monies through capital markets. So essentially what happens is we work with the individual communities. So say my First Nation wishes to finance $5 million, Brent First Nation wishes to finance $10 million. When we can reach at least a minimum of $100 million, we will pool that and then approach the capital markets after receiving the blessing from our board of directors. But it's also important to note that we work with a banking syndicate. So a lot of times there are a lot of myths out there, Brent, that we kind of chatted about. And, some people say, well, you don't work with banks. We actually do work with banks very closely, and the banks are great partners of ours and work with us every time we want to issue a debenture. So we're very grateful for those relationships, and we've been successful in going to the market and issuing 8 debentures to date. And also important to note that all of the bonds or debentures that we've issued, or most of them, I shouldn't say all of them, the latest ones have all been pre-sold. So there's no shortage. Investors have a lot of comfort in how we operate, how our model operates, the projects that we're financing, and they're willing, there's no shortage. They're very interested in what we're doing and what the First Nations are doing. Yeah,
well, certainly in this market with the very hot capital markets and low interest rate environment, it's great that you'll be able to take advantage of those opportunities and lower the cost of capital for these projects. So
absolutely,
that's great. I think there are also a lot of misconceptions about the amount of risk that the nations are taking when they access your facility. I think there's a perception that if I borrow $1 from this authority, I'm responsible for everybody else's project. And we talked about this a couple of days ago. Can you maybe bust that myth for us?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you asked the question. And so we're actually a very low risk model. And I should say this, I love saying this stat because not enough people or investors understand that no First Nation has defaulted on a loan since prior to 1970. And so there's actually very little risk associated with that. And it's a great positive story or a great stat to highlight for sure. And I think, because we operate as a borrowing pool, there's this misconception and misunderstanding that if my First Nation borrows $5 million and defaults on a loan, the Brent First Nation has to pick up that $5 million. And in fact, that's not really how we operate. I often get the question, are we joint and several? We are not legally joint and several. We operate kind of a quasi joint and several. And I say that in quotations because local government models are not legally joint and several, which means that if one member of the pooled borrowing defaults, the remaining members must pay off the defaulting member's loan balance. This is not what happens at the local government pooled borrowing approach, nor does it happen at the FNFA model either. Instead, both the FNFA model and local government models operate under an annual basis. So we say, were enough monies collected from the members to pay the annual interest that's owed to the investors?
Right.
And this is called a replenishment model, whereby if a problem exists where one member of the pool cannot support their interest obligation, then the other members of the pool would be asked to contribute an amount to make up that shortfall in the interim. A shortfall has never occurred at either the local government pool or the FNFA level. And in how we operate at the FNFA is if a First Nation wishes to borrow, say $1 million, we will ask them to borrow 5% more than what's required. So an additional $50,000 in this case. Okay, and so we take that $50,000, we put it into the debt reserve fund, which is a 5% holdback with the First Nation's name on it. That 5% will really carry the First Nation where they're in a case where there's an interruption in a revenue stream for about 18 months of interest
Okay.
payments. Okay.
Right.
So,
Yep.
yeah, sorry, go ahead, Brent.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the main point there, Jody, is that, you know, this is a reasonable risk proposition for a community that wants to pursue a project. And so I guess my next logical question would be, you know, if a community does wish to move forward with a project, can you maybe just take us a little bit through the way you look at projects, you know, what your parameters are, and the best way to engage with the FNFA?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to note that there's a number of safeguards in place that we have. The first safeguard, and that where First Nations need to begin, is the certification process that begins with the First Nations Financial Management Board. And the FMB really sets the standard, the financial standard, governance and policies in terms of how the First Nation is operating in their financial, and looks at their financial performance. So they need to have that certification in place before they come and knock on our door at the FNFA. And that's important because all of the First Nations who become members with the FNFA receive the same rate. And because we operate as a pool. And so we need to make sure that all First Nations have met the same standard in terms of what they're doing. So it's important to start with the FMB. First Nations can start talking with us. That's no problem at all. And we can work in parallel while they're going after their certification with the FMB.
So a First Nation goes through the FMB first, and that's sort of step one, and then they become a member of the FNFA, and then at that point they're eligible, I guess, to submit an application for financing.
Yeah, we will look at the project that they are looking at, and we want to make sure that this project, first and foremost, has the blessing of the First Nation. We get a lot of, corporations and consultants, if you will, calling us saying, hey, I have this great idea, but they haven't done the consultation piece yet with the First Nations. And so it's really important that we work directly with the First Nations, that they truly understand what they are engaging into. And it doesn't matter, it could be an economic, it could be infrastructure. And so we look at existing revenue streams within the First Nation that help to service the debt. So it's not something that they're purchasing. It's certainly something that's already existing in terms of a revenue stream that can support those debt servicing payments. So lots of due diligence takes place. Oliver mentioned earlier, there's a number of analysis and professionals that need to be engaged early on, whether it's valuations or legal opinions on agreements and help and so on and so forth.
So it's fair to say then that the community needs to have some existing assets to provide coverage for the loan in addition to the project that they're pursuing.
Yeah, I wouldn't say assets, Brent. I would say existing revenue streams. So we work based on an interception model. So we will intercept existing revenue streams to service the debt that the community has. And also, because the borrowing capacity is based on existing revenue streams, it protects and prevents the community from over borrowing, so that they're always in a situation where they can safely service the debt.
And, we'll talk about Clearwater a little later, but I mean, that was a very large transaction. So I guess one question that jumps to my mind is, if there is a project that a community wants to pursue that's larger than the amount of financing that you can do in a intercepted model, how do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, it's a good question. And we're actually seeing a lot more movement and activity since the Clearwater transaction. Certainly, I think nations are really saying they may not be able to carry that debt load as an individual community, but if they pool their buying power with other First Nations and other nations, collectively, they can come together to make a meaningful, a purchase per se. So,
I see.
and it helps to diversify the risk as well in terms of,
So it's a pooling model on top of the pooling model that you already have, really.
They can, I mean, First Nations can come individually. We work individually or with individual First Nations, but they can say, hey, Stephen, Brent, Oliver, let's pool our buying power together to combine, our resources. And it creates a massive and a very powerful tool for First Nations.
And, you've had a lot of success stories recently. You maybe just want to mention one?
I have to pick one.
I know you've got many to pick. I mean, you mentioned Henvey Inlet to me earlier. That sounded like a very big success story.
Yeah, Henvey Inlet First Nation, certainly near and dear to my heart. Being an Ontario girl, I like to highlight Ontario success stories, but they're all across Canada, I should say. Right. Henvey Inlet First Nation is a small First Nation that's located kind of central northern Ontario, just off Georgian Bay, and they were able to partner with a wind proponent, Pattern Energy, and purchase 50% of Henvey Inlet Wind. And so, which is a really big deal in terms of equity stake. And they now, that project went live in 2019. It's a 300 megawatt wind farm that is now home to 87 of the world's largest turbines. They have 2 service stations. They're now able to power over 110,000 homes in Ontario with clean energy. And from the First Nations perspective, there's a lot of First Nations who didn't have access to these revenue streams before. So in this particular case, it was a game changer. This community in particular has now moved from managing poverty and living off government transfers to managing wealth, which is a very big deal in this community and a game changer for many generations. So it's a wonderful story. The amount of work that this First Nation engaged in is phenomenal. So I mean, kudos to them. They did an extraordinary job with this.
Now, that project was located on reserve, was it not?
It was, yeah.
So how did you go about doing that?
So the way that particular reserve, it's broken up into 2 sections. So they had one full section that was greenfield. It was a greenfield project. And so they were able to work with the company in order to bring in the infrastructure because literally nothing was there. So they had to build the transmission lines. They had to, build the roads. They had to enact a land code. They had to do a number of things, an environmental protection code. There was just so many steps, and this all happened over a 10-year period. And they took advantage of some of the programs that Oliver was alluding to earlier as well. Which had they not existed, that community would not have had the opportunity to engage and meaningfully participate in a project of this magnitude. And
interesting too, because that was a greenfield project. You were not buying an existing business. So
that's right. Yeah.
If you guys can do greenfield deals, that's fantastic. So maybe Steve, I'll come back to you. So financing is a tool that we've just talked about, but Oliver chatted earlier about the need for capacity and access to resources and access to professionals. You've spent a lot of time being one of those professionals, advising First Nations on different types of mining project developments. And so I think it's important to sort of talk about how having access to financial expertise is important. And maybe you could spend a little bit of time describing some of those tools that that are available to assist communities when they're negotiating these financial packages.
Well, I'm going to try to be true to the webinar's title called "Frankly Speaking" there, Brent. and the thing about the mining company executives and First Nation discussion is there's always a lot of anxiety that starts between these discussions, and that anxiety stems from, well, how much are they going to ask for? What are they going to want? What are they talking about? What are they saying? And Oliver and I were involved together in a transaction where those communications actually broke down, just because there wasn't really a good understanding of the needs of both proponents on the First Nation side and on the mining side. So in that transaction, that was I would say an excellent outcome a transaction that could have gone the wrong way just due to miscommunication. And the miscommunication is understanding what both sides really need and want, and understand and translating that discussion. In one of the files we worked on, the First Nations were saying, look, this is very helpful to us because we were able to translate what the mining company was trying to say from a financial point of view so that it was understandable to all parties, and vice versa, going to the mining company and saying, look, it's not all about A and B, there's C and D portions of the financial benefits that are very important to the First Nations. So in our role, the tools that we use are the financial tools. We were able to, give credibility and trust between the two parties, in that a lot of times the anxiety stems from, well, they're asking for too much, or they're trying to rip us off, or they're not giving us what we're really due. But the main factor here for both parties to benefit is for the mine to be able to go through. So in our role, what we do is to ensure that the First Nations get a fair compensation without risking the financial capabilities of the mine, meaning the ability to finance the mine to go forward. Because if you can't finance the mine, nobody wins, and the mine doesn't go forward. So a lot of our conversations were about, what are the parameters that enable maximum value to the First Nations, in the meantime, not stressing the mine too much so that they can't get their financing.
And at the end of the day, I guess that relates to rate of return and the ability of the project to service the project debt and the equity that's required. So I would think, having I think in the case that you're talking about with you and Oliver, there was basically an open book financial model that was shared between the First Nations and the mining proponent. And so part of your role would be to work with that model and see how you fit things in, on a year-by-year basis.
Exactly. So the benefit of many of these mining projects, as we all know, is they'll have a feasibility study, and there'll be an embedded model in that feasibility study. And our role is to take that feasibility study and basically modify it to incorporate the financial compensation or benefits appropriated to the First Nations communities that are involved. And a lot of times the First Nations aren't really that interested, frankly, in dissecting these models or taking these models and trying to figure out on their own. So that's where we came in to be quite helpful, working with Oliver and the First Nations and the mining company to say, here's the model, here's how it's transparent, this is the impact we're having, and this is what it means in terms of being able to finance a project. And explaining, look, the banks who are financing the project development, they have this hurdle. So we have to make sure that whatever financial arrangements that we put together don't impact, the ability for the banks to say, yes, we're going to go forward. At the same time, the First Nations need comfort that, they're getting something meaningful. And an example of that is, we were working on a file a while ago that was done years ago. And in this file, the IBA, the Impact Benefit Agreement, had a stipulation that they would pay him a certain percentage of net profit interest. And again, frankly speaking, in our world, a net profit interest, an NPI, is a euphemism really for no payments intended. Right. And so we had that discussions with the First Nations, and they said, "Wow, we didn't realize this, that this NPI was really could be of low value." So right. in that discussion, we had a very constructive discussion with the mining company to kind of alter that payment scheme. And what we do is we look for areas in the income statement or cash flow where it would be better for the First Nations to receive compensation. And that was, again, another good outcome in terms of being able to repair a very old form of IBA.
It sounds like, translation is a really important thing here. Oliver, you've been around the block on these things a lot of times. How to how do mining companies and or resource companies, energy companies, infrastructure entities, how do you bridge that translation gap so that the First Nations feel like they can trust what's going on? Because trust is obviously something that is historically been in very short supply, quite rightly. So how have you seen that trust get rebuilt and that translation that Steve's talking about happen?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really excellent question, and that's the nub of the entire engagement that frequently has to happen. I think that from the project proponent side, there's frequently a misunderstanding about how the land is actually used. I mean, Canada is a huge country, and the majority of the population doesn't live up north where many of these projects are, and there's a lack of understanding that people actually do still go out on the land and hunt for a living to support their livelihood. There's a huge amount of knowledge about how the land operates, how the wildlife migrates, on an annual basis, trap lines that are used. So there's an intimate understanding of the land that exists. And so if a mine is to come in, there's a acute amount of sensitivity about how these behaviors are going to change sometimes on a permanent basis. And I think that there's an obligation of the chief and council of the First Nation to ensure that if a mine is proceeding in this area, it is worth the impact to the land and the lifestyle, perhaps permanently, for the First Nation. And so just in terms of what Steve's talking about, there has been an experience of negotiating IBAs in good faith historically, and then having no real meaningful benefit come out of that relationship. And that's a terrible thing to perpetuate. It just re-perpetuates history that we've been trying to get away from. And so, if a company can understand that that's the perspective that a First Nation is coming from, that there's a huge amount of accountability for the people on the First Nation side sitting around the table to ensure that they reach a meaningful agreement, then that starts to be the building blocks of that trust start to get established. And that's a main thing from a project proponent side, that sometimes, you see the shoe drop in the meeting, and then all of a sudden a light bulb goes on because the guys have been up there enough to understand how the community operates. And then, so that's the First Nation side. On the mining side, it's just what Steve is talking about. There's often a full understanding about the worry the First Nations have about how they're going to be impacted, not a full understanding of what it takes to actually get a mine operating. And that was, when we were working with Steve, was so excellent, is because there was a significant amount of experience of that incredible amount of effort. Jody talked about the 300 megawatt project getting off the ground in Henby Inlet. It's a huge amount of work to do that. And so you have the mining side coming from that perspective and the First Nation side coming from that perspective. You can build a bridge of trust where there's comprehension about the pressures that each side's facing. Then there's a chance that we're going to be able to build something that's actually meaningful. And that's the main work, I think, that the advisors can provide.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that strikes me in some of the transactions I've been involved in is I don't think project developers really understand some of these key concepts. Like, Jody, we talked about this, sustainability. It's not just about, getting a certain amount of cash and then the mine runs out and then, everyone goes away. Can you just sort of speak to that aspect of it? Building the capacity within these communities, putting them in a position where, they can actually capitalize on business opportunities related to the construction or the operation of these projects, so that the communities have something that makes them more sustainable and enables them to grow in the future.
Yeah, and I think that's really important when these types of agreements and negotiations are happening. It's not just the financial participation or the equity participation. It's the other benefits that could meaningfully make a positive impact on the community. Training, jobs, procurement of contracts related to those types of businesses in and around the area, so that there's other benefits that the community can see, and the other revenue streams that may be generated, aside from this just one revenue stream from the mine. Can the communities go in and be a part of the procurement or the equipment or the catering or anything like that that would also benefit the First Nation? It's really important. And it's not just that First Nations would like to have a seat at the table. It's not just about the revenue streams. They want to say in what's happening in and around their territory. They would like a seat at the table. They want to be a part of the decision-making process and contribute towards the decision-making process rather than just being kind of an afterthought. So there's more, those are meaningful things that need to be considered as well.
And, maybe just briefly, I mean, we're running out of time, but I do want to note that on that point about being partners, I mean, the most recent popular example that I think people are aware about is the Clearwater Transaction, where a community of communities, became full partners in a transaction that, a competitive auction process where, they were the winning bidder. So maybe, and you were involved in that transaction, can you maybe just very briefly talk about that success story?
Yeah, sure. That was definitely a big one and turned a lot of heads, not just across Canada, but internationally, and really seen as a big power move on part of the 7 First Nations. And there's a few things that, that I've seen. They said member 2 bought Clearwater. It was actually a group of 7 First Nations that had come together. So the First Nations were Buttigieg, Wacoba, Pictou Landing, Member 2, Mi'kmaq in Newfoundland and Labrador, Spaganagity and Potlatech. And so just as we were talking about earlier, not one of those communities could come up with the financing to service that debt on their own. So what they did, and all communities in Nova Scotia had the opportunity to participate. So all of these 7 First Nations actually came together and pooled their buying power. They created what was called the Mi'kmaq Coalition. That coalition now has 100% ownership of all Clearwater Canadian lobster fishing quotas. And they used the $250 million loan from the FNFA to help purchase those fishing quotas, or their licenses, so to speak. So they also partnered with Premium Brand Foods, another excellent company located out of BC, for the other 50%, or to help them under a subordinated debt agreement. So that helped in the transaction moving forward. So partners and relationships are really important.
Yeah.
And, I'll never forget in hearing Chief Terry Paul from Member 2 saying, don't forget that all of this happened during COVID when nobody could travel.
Right.
And, the chief said, I have yet to shake the hand of the CEO of Premium Brand Foods and the gentleman that helped to, or not the gentleman, but the teams that helped to secure this deal. So it was a major transaction. It was definitely transformational. It helps in helping the communities diversify their existing financial portfolio by investing in a secure industry that aligns with their culture and traditions. And that was really important to us. Certainly that, that 50% stake, that they had a say in how things would move going forward. And it's important to know also that these were the offshore fishing licenses, which is very different from the inshore and the moderate livelihood discussions that are still taking place today. So I think the timing of everything, there was some misunderstanding, but certainly a massive win for the Mi'kmaq and First Nations right across Canada.
Yeah.
And we're seeing a lot of activity as a result.
And I think it really highlights the theme of our program today, which is, it's a win-win roadmap to commercial success.
Yeah, absolutely.
So again, I want to thank all of you for contributing today. I think we have a couple of minutes for a little bit of Q&A. So I've got one here, and maybe Oliver, I'll direct this one to you. But it says, would you say greenfield deals are more likely to be approved from a regulatory standpoint if they involve First Nations and are located on First Nations land? Indeed, might that be the only way greenfield deals get approved in Canada now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think actually the development of projects on First Nations lands is actually really difficult, and that's because the land tenure mechanisms of the Indian Act are what apply instead of the provincial law. And so the Indian Act is not well suited to undertaking large commercial development because there's a underlying ownership of the land in trust for the First Nation by the federal government. So the federal government's always very, very worried from a liability perspective to approve projects that might alter the land unless there's an extreme amount of referendums and consent and all of these things to ensure that the government's protected from future liability. So I would actually say that part of why the development of the things that we're talking about today have occurred conspicuously off reserve is because on reserve projects are such a challenge to get off the ground. So we have success stories like Henby Inlet, which involved a lot of work for a lot of years to get the land tenure in place to be able to build that project. But I would say that in terms of greenfield projects, there's a stronger likelihood that that off reserve is the place where those would be able to get off the ground.
I see. I mean, have people tried to employ other types of structures like long-term leases or things like that to do things on reserve?
Yeah, I mean, frankly speaking, the concern is just that there's a third party involved in all of these discussions, which is the government.
Right.
The federal government, Indian Act, they need to make sure that the leases are approved from their policy perspective, and those aren't always. You have to meet commercially reasonable timeframes in order to get a project off the ground. But if you're working with a government representative of Indigenous Services Canada, whose primary concern is future liability potentially coming back against the government, there's a huge amount of protection around the way that those departments negotiate these leases, and they have final consent on that lease being approved. So it just anyone with any familiarity with the permitting processes that are required from public bodies, knows that that's an uncertainty in and of itself that creates a challenge there. So that's the issue with respect to that. Certainly there has been creativity. It's usually communities that have had the foresight that they'll need to be able to develop those lands some point in the future. Then they designate the land early for a certain type of industrial use. That has to pass a referendum. Then a project comes along in the future and someone says, oh, that's already all done already. Now we can move forward with a particular project. And Aamjiwnaang First Nation, besides Sarnia, has been very, very effective with their industrial park for that precise reason. They designated the land years ago and then took advantage of opportunities that arose in the 90s.
Well, that's excellent. Thank you. I've got another question here. It's quite a long one, so I'm not going to read it to you, but I think the basic theme is a proponent trying to help develop infrastructure to develop reliable access to potable water and also developing waste treatment systems for such communities. So Jody, I might direct this one to you. Do you have particularly thoughts on or experience relating to opportunities and challenges with developing water and wastewater facilities on these communities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a bit of a loaded question. Infrastructure is our bread and butter, certainly. And right now, a $30 billion infrastructure gap currently exists between First Nations and other communities in Canada. So really what we're, one of our goals is to close this infrastructure gap. And so we can work with First Nations in order to get these types of infrastructures in place. And, we're talking about economic development on reserve. Well, it's very hard to invest or to attract investors into a greenfield space when you don't have these types of infrastructure in place. And so one we need to do better at closing that gap for our First Nations. And I think, living in the South and not being familiar with what's happening in a lot of the communities, we're not privy, we don't see the reality of that infrastructure deficit. So it's really important that we move quickly to try and close that infrastructure gap and think outside of the box, because currently there's a pay-as-you-go system that exists within the First Nations, and it's not closing that gap and will not keep up with the rate at which we need this infrastructure.
Right.
And we need to move
That's
faster
why,
and do better.
And that's the distinction between financing versus funding, and trying to monetize these opportunities rather than just pay as you go.
Absolutely. We can do it faster, cheaper than the pay-as-you-go system. So we're ready to go.
Okay, and I've got one more question here, which is a plug for MPA. So I'm going to throw this to Steve. And the question is, how have mining companies or other resource development companies reacted to having an investment banker advising the First Nations in IBA discussions?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. I think our experience has been that it's actually been a welcome addition in the theme of the translating portion. It's been important that the First Nation communities and the mining company management team have kind of this mediator role or translator role, whatever you want to call it, so that somebody truly understands the needs of both sides. And frankly speaking, when we work with OKT Law in doing that, there's a team that's able to kind of bridge that gap. So that's worked out really well. And again, we look forward. We're working on certain deals that make the First Nations truly a partner with the mining company. And as part of that, we'll be coming to you, Jody, in terms of looking for opportunities to help finance this initiative that truly makes the First Nations a partner with the mining company.
We'll be happy to have that discussion soon.
Well, look, we're sort of getting to the end of our hour here. So there are a lot of questions that people have asked that we've not had an opportunity to answer. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the questions that haven't been answered, and we'll undertake to get those dealt with and distributed to those people that asked questions after the webinar closes. And maybe we'll do like a after hours with Bill Maher or something to deal with those questions. So I want to first of all thank my panelists, Jody and Steve and Oliver, for contributing. I mean, there's we could easily go on for another hour here. This is a very big and historical deficit that we have to bridge here, and so we could talk for much longer. And so, but thank you for your contributions today. And I think you really helped to illuminate things for our audience. And I would also like to thank our audience members for participating today. We appreciate the time that people are spending to listen to these issues, and the more we talk about them, the more we can advance things. So again, thank you, everybody. I would like also to say that we're going to continue to have these Frankly Speaking webinar series into the future. So look forward to hearing more from us on LinkedIn and Twitter and other social media. We expect to be having our next one hopefully in the mid to late June timeframe. So we'll look forward to seeing you all there. And again, thank you very much. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for having us. Really enjoyed the discussion.
Yep. Okay. Thank you.